Philosophy is a tough subject for non-philosophers to understand. What does it do? What's the point of it? Is it even a subject at all? And if not, what is it? A method, a way of thinking? Can it arrive at answers, or is the best it can ever do to keep spitting out new questions? The best understanding of philosophy I've seen was given by the philosopher Mary Midgley. When discussing what the use of philosophy is, she wrote that we should see philosophy as a sort of conceptual plumbing. Imagine a bathroom with a sink, toilet, and bathtub. Underneath it all, both underneath the pipes and maybe the floor and walls, there's a hidden system of plumbing that makes it all work flawlessly. But when it doesn't, one has to start thinking about the previously hidden from view system of plumbing. Is a pipe clogged? Has something come unhinged? Has a pipe that was previously serviceable gone bad and stopped working? Does something need to be replaced, or can we just tune something up? Here's how Midgley elaborates her analogy. Plumbing and philosophy are both activities that arise because elaborate cultures like ours have beneath their surface a fairly complex system, which is usually unnoticed, but which sometimes goes wrong. In both cases, this can have serious consequences. Each system supplies vital needs for those who live above it. Each is hard to repair when it does go wrong, because neither of them was ever consciously planned as a whole. Think about philosophy as like that plumbing. When we talk about issues, we often bring implicit understandings, worldviews, ways of seeing things with us that we don't articulate but that are doing some of the conceptual work. When I say that isn't fair and this is a better way to do it, I'm not articulating my notion of what I mean by fair, and when you disagree with me and tell me that the way things are really is fair after all, we might argue and argue without ever really doing what philosophers might do, which is to start exploring our competing ideas of what fairness demands and seeing if we can articulate arguments for and against each. Another example, say that you're confident and you know that X is true, I'm confident that I know X isn't true, what I say is true is your fake news and vice versa. We argue and argue, but both of us seem to have reasons for thinking that our version is the truth, capital T. Here are some questions. That is conceptual plumbing a philosopher might ask and see if they can get both of you to focus on. What type of evidence is sufficient to say that something is true? Is it always the case that there's a single truth for each matter? What type of further inquiry can you two do to settle this matter? Is it possible that the sources each of you trusts are wrong? And how would you find out? Why do you trust the sources you do? These aren't just idle questions either. Midgley is right that these are issues of conceptual plumbing, trying to get at the conceptual stuff that each of us presupposes when we talk, but that we rarely ever articulate. When our toilets clog and our sinks don't work, we almost guarantee that we don't solve the problem when we ignore the plumbing. Fixing the plumbing, potentially, not always, fixes the issues. Argument is also like that. When we all agree on what is fair and what the truth is, we don't need to think about the conceptual issues. But when we do disagree, it's often helpful to start thinking about them. Are we operating on different notions of what fairness means or how to get at truth? Can we articulate arguments for and against each of those to see which holds up better? It doesn't guarantee that the problem gets solved, but it might. And at very least, it helps us to clarify what might be at issue and not just keep talking past each other. To drive home the point, here's the philosopher Isaiah Berlin with a similar take on what philosophy does. The task of philosophy, he says, often a difficult and painful one, is to extricate and bring to light the hidden categories and models in terms of which human beings think, to reveal what is obscure or contradictory in them, to discern the conflicts between them that prevent construction of more adequate ways of organizing and describing and explaining experience. Many philosophers would say that they, quote, extricate and bring to light the hidden categories and models, end quote, because doing so helps them get to truths. Truths about what the right notion of fairness is, the right way to determine what the truth is, etc. Others, and I will confess that I lie closer to this side, believe that philosophy might not be able to get to those truths about those things, either because it all really does come down to differing opinions, or because if there's an answer about what fairness or truth really is, we humans are fated never to know whether we're correct about those truths. Even in that admittedly worst case, there are still reasons philosophy can be useful. First, doing it helps you appreciate those things that you're philosophizing about more. Justice seems like an easy issue that we can stop really paying attention to until someone comes along and attacks your ideas of justice or advocates some other unattractive view of it. Then it's time to start thinking about the importance of getting justice right. Second, thinking through these issues helps you clarify what you really think. You might find that you support an idea of justice that you find hard to produce good arguments for, in which case you might rethink or clarify your position. Last, even if philosophy can't offer ultimate answers to problems, it can help you think in different ways about the issues at play in the problems. If you're thinking through whether to tell a lie to your friend that you might think could ultimately save that friend from pain, philosophy might not give you a frictionless answer, but it might help articulate that the friction comes from the competing demands that you feel between working for your friend's happiness and being transparent with them and what each of those values really means. Maybe then there's another analogy that we can use for philosophy besides plumbing. Maybe philosophers are more like therapists, people who can help you get at the root of conceptual problems that you have. With a therapist, you might go if you are sad or anxious and not sure why, and while the therapist can't give you the answer for making everything right, she probably can help you dig into your psyche to pinpoint potential sources of the problem and ways to move forward. It's a good way to think about what philosophy can do when we think about what the meaning of life is or through thorny ethical dilemmas. This gets us to the issue of philosophy of education specifically, and why it can be a productive exercise. Staying with Midgley's analogy, schools are huge places and school districts are even bigger places. Imagine the vast and tangled conceptual plumbing underneath those. For one thing, schools are tied to societies, cultures, nations, citizenship, etc., so however we think those things should be arranged will in some way impact what we think schools should do. School also opens up messy moral issues about what we can and can't compel from our youngest members of society, the proper relationship between families, the government, and the larger society, how much uniformity of knowledge and behavior we have a right to expect from citizens prepared by the school. And these are just some of the conceptual issues schooling invites us to think philosophically about. But just like with our regular plumbing, we seldom talk about conceptual plumbing. Colleges of education teach teachers how to write lesson plans, but they rarely ask those teachers to reflect on how much of a lesson should be planned. We teach about classroom management, but we don't give a lot of space to talking about the conceptual issues beneath that idea, like what the proper moral dynamic is between teacher and student, what the purposes of punishing students are. For instance, is it establishing order, rehabilitation, or even the ethics of thinking about classroom kids as needing to be managed? Here's an example of the difference between how a philosopher and non-philosopher might approach a current issue in education. There's been a lot of talk recently about how or whether to teach about race and sex/gender in schools. And questions arise, like how much emphasis do we put on America's tragic relationship to race? Teach this race-centric and seemingly pessimistic curriculum? Or this other curriculum that focuses mostly on the positive work America's done to become more racially inclusive? As a philosopher, one thing that bugs me about how these current debates go is that we rarely get to the conceptual issues that might be necessary to help us debate more productively. For instance, each side says that they, and not the other side, just want to teach the facts. As a philosopher, I want to suggest that this invites us to think about how we know what the historical facts are, especially in areas where each side can seemingly cite credible facts and sources. How can we determine what the actual facts are? Is there an objective way to do it? Or can different parties legitimately hold different accounts of the facts? I would ask these questions not simply to annoy people or drown us in questions, but so that we can move the discussion to the potentially more productive issues, where each side offers arguments in hopes of actually persuading the other. As a philosopher, I'd also love folks in these debates to talk about what they think the purpose of teaching history is to begin with. Is it, as the conservatives are more likely to say, to create a nation of people who love their country for the perceived good it has done, despite acknowledging its flaws? Or is it, as liberals and progressives are more likely to say, to inspire people to continue working for social change above and beyond what their country has already done in the past? A third conceptual dimension of the question above involves who has the right to decide these matters. If enough parents decide that their children will be made uncomfortable by a certain view of history or anything else, does that give them a right to demand its removal, even if the experts in the relevant field disagree? Is it moral for students who generally have to be in school and have very little choice of what they learn to be forced to learn what does not interest them or might make them uncomfortable if it's for their own good? If yes, how do we determine what is good for students, especially if the good we're entertaining is an imagined future good? In cases where the parents in the school system, let alone the kids, disagree on what the kid's own good is, who gets to decide in any given case? These are all questions of conceptual plumbing, the type of questions we often don't think consciously about, but probably still have unarticulated intuitions on. Philosophy brings those intuitions out into the open for all to see, so that we and whoever we might be talking to can examine them, better articulate them, and better see how compelling they are. Maybe philosophy can help us answer the questions we approach philosophically, but even if it can't, it's still arguably a worthwhile exercise for the reasons I laid out above. What can all of this philosophical thinking do for teachers? It can make you more thoughtful about your craft and the conceptual elements in it. It can also better allow you to formulate and argue positions in order to convince others, or conversely, find holes in arguments used by others on you. Here's a final example of where I wish I had experience with philosophy when I was a high school teacher. One day, a student of mine, annoyed that I told him to focus on his work, bolted from his seat, cursed at me, stormed out of my room. My attendance policy stated that if students leave the classroom without permission, they'll be marked absent, so that's what I did. 15 minutes later, he showed up at the door with a social worker who pleaded to me to let the student back into class after telling me all the burdens this student was under at home. So I had a choice. Let him back in the classroom at the expense of enforcing my policy, or hold to my policy and risk turning a blind eye to his situation. At the time, I didn't think of this in philosophical terms, but it might have helped if I had. On one hand, I could have adhered to a rule-based ethical code, one that aspires to be neutral by holding everyone to the same set of rules. On the other, though, I could have followed a more situational ethic, where there's less importance on adherence to rules and more on attuning your treatment of others to the needs of the people involved. There are pros and cons to each of those approaches, and I won't get into that, but thinking philosophically about the issues might have actually helped me make a bit more of a considered decision. It also might have helped me articulate my rationale to anyone, maybe a parent or supervisor, who disagreed with or questioned my judgment. It could also have helped me defend my position against objections. Most areas of learning involve taking things you know little about and learning more about them. I like to say philosophy is the reverse. Philosophy deals with things we feel like we know quite well, institutions like schools that we take for granted, or ideas like morality that we relegate to common sense, and makes them less familiar by poking them with questions and asking whether there are actually good arguments for these various common sense positions. It might seem jarring, like the point is to talk us out of all of our convictions, but really the point of philosophy is to talk us all into rigorously reflecting on the things that we normally wouldn't.